Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and today I want to take you through how to propagate rosemary from cuttings. And I'm just starting from a little 4-inch herb pot like this one here, but I bet you even with something as small as this that I'll be able to get 15 or 20 cuttings off of that, so I'll have plenty of plants going into next spring. I will be discussing some things that are rosemary specific, but really this video is very similar to the method I used on lavender not too long ago. I'll link that video above in case you want some other examples or want to see how I finished those up. All right, let's look at the plants. Okay, really basic method here. I'll be using this plant plus a bunch over here as well to fill out this tray, and this tray has 105 cells in it. So I filled that with potting soil. I'll say a bit more about the potting soil in just a minute here, and also I'll be using rooting powder to help speed along the rooting. Now I've seen a version of this done recently where they took a cutting like this, a whole big stem like that, just stripped the leaves off the bottom, did some scoring across the bottom of the cutting, and stuck the whole thing into a pot. And you know, I suspect you could succeed that way too, but to me it just seems like wasted opportunity. When I see a big long stem like this here, I think I can get a cutting from the top here, right around there. I can probably get another cutting right around there, at least a third cutting, and maybe even a fourth cutting off of this, all using the same technique. So let me show you how I start with that here. When I discuss cuttings, I usually discuss a couple of terms. The first one is to discuss the firmness of the wood. So if you look here, this whole stem is emerged from this year's growth. So this is all fresh growth, but the stuff at the very tip here is very, very soft, while the stuff at the bottom here, if you see me trying to bend it here, it's quite firm. In fact, you can see that the color at the bottom is much darker than the color of the stem near the middle here. So this is the firmer end towards the bottom of the plant. This is the softer end. What I'm looking for is somewhat soft to semi-hardwood growth. I think the stuff at the top here may end up being a little too soft for my purposes. It's just freshly emerged growth. So I'm going to cut that off before I start taking any cuttings. Okay, the next term I talk about usually is about nodes. And happily, on rosemary, the nodes are plentiful. Every place where you see any of these leaves emerge, that's a node. And so I'm going to cut this one down at, I'll give it 3 nodes. And that's a cutting. And it isn't any harder than that. It's just take it like that, give it a quick dip in your rooting hormone, and then stick it into the tray, and then go ahead and take your next cutting. From the same stem here, just going to count down, 1, 2, and maybe down to a 3rd node again, and that's my next cutting. Having taken a few cuttings off of here from the top in that semi-hardwood region, you can see how easily it cuts. As I cut down the stem, you may notice that it starts to get a little harder to cut. That's because you're progressing into that firmer wood. Here it's just fine, but you see how the wood there is darker, and as I cut here, now it's harder to cut. As you get into that woody section, it actually is time to stop, because the woodier it is, the harder it will be to get that to root. It's going to take more time, and so these parts with the dark brown stems on them are not cuttings for you. Look for the stuff that has the lighter green and is still relatively easy to cut. This is a point that I can make about rosemary, and it's going to be useful for you in a different context. Rosemary is not truly an herbaceous perennial as they're sold in the stores. It's actually a sub-shrub. So as you leave it out in the landscape, you'll find that just like its cousin lavender, low down it starts to get really, really woody at the base. And the woodier it gets at the base, and if you let it get a little bit overgrown, that part of the plant becomes inactive. This is exactly where the rosemary dies off in the winter, is when it's left with that really, really woody base, and the winter comes, it kills off the top growth, so the soft, fresh, active growth at the top of the plant, and all that's left is that really, really woody base. So in my climate, rosemary is sort of semi-hardy. It's hardy like 3 years out of 4. Well, in that 4th year, a cold wind comes through, and kills off all that top growth, and all that's left is that sort of inactive wood at the very base of the plant, and then the plant dies. So, two things about that. One, do your pruning each year after flowering or after growth, sometime midsummer. Give it a prune down so that you have, say, 4 inches of active growth. I'll show you on this here, is if you cut it down like this to the point where you still have active growth on the stem, then you're going to save that plant. You're going to keep all the active buds down low, and it's going to be able to shoot again in the spring. Whereas if you let it go super tall and you let this woody section at the bottom get inactive, then there's a greater risk it's going to die. Second thing you can do, of course, is take cuttings like this. You'll have fresh plants to go in the spring. So I told you that I would talk a little bit about the potting mix that I used to fill up this tray. Here it is. I'll show it to you. Now you don't have to look for anything very similar to this, but I'll describe it for you anyway. It has some bigger chunks in here that are composted bark mulch, and then the smaller bits are just made out of shredded wood fiber. This is what I pot my roses into on my farm here, and I've just made it use double duty for my propagation mix. Now, it holds a fair amount of moisture. It also holds a fair amount of air. That's what a potting mix is supposed to do. Replacements for this, or substitutes locally, you'll find very commonly a peat and perlite mix in the stores, in those compressed bales. So that's perfectly fine to do propagation in. Other times you'll find that people propagate either directly into perlite or pumice or sand, or other times they'll use coconut fiber. All of those are perfectly valid. The only one thing that I won't recommend is using your regular garden soil in this. Now, my soil supplier described this to me as a biological desert. And what he means is it's not sterile, but it actually has very little in the way of life in it, not a lot of bacteria, not a lot of fungus, not currently. Whereas a garden soil has, thousands of times more organisms in it. Many of those are specific plant pathogens. That is, they're in there kind of either to rot dead plant parts or to attack plants as they grow. And that's going to be very threatening, of course, for your brand new cuttings, which don't really have anything in the way of defenses. They have that cut stem at the very bottom. So the pathogens are looking for a way in, and by using a cleaner mix like this, you actually avoid some of those early rot problems. Well, I filled up my cutting tray here, 105 cuttings, and I'll give you a close-up view. You can see they're not exactly uniform, but close enough in terms of firmness and hardness and length that I shouldn't have any problem getting those all to root in the same conditions. As for those conditions, well, I've taken this inside because we're going into fall now. Outdoor temperatures are getting colder, and so this I can keep at a nice stable temperature, and the light I've topped up. It's underneath a south window anyway, but I've topped it up with artificial light just to keep those hours up because the days are starting to get shorter. As for humidity, I'm placing it underneath a humidity dome. And I showed you this previously with my lavender video. It's just a Tupperware bin. This is the lid here. This is the base. And I've drilled some holes in the top just to stop the air from getting too stale. You can see as I put this on that I've sprayed the inside of the bin already just to get that humidity up initially. And we'll be able to check back on this, within the next couple to 3 weeks, just to see if I can see that some rooting has initiated. Time to show you the results here, and I'm going to zoom in and show you the beautiful roots on these rosemary. Now, I will say that between these and the lavender did root a little bit quicker, but that is a bit to be expected because of the stage I took the cuttings in. The lavenders I took in fresh, young cuttings early in spring. These were taken in fall when the days were already shortening and the plants were starting to think about going into dormancy. I think that would have affected them. However, the rooting hormone that I put onto the base of the plants did convince them, so this is what I ended up with. A success rate so far of about 70% of the tray. So 70 rosemary plants that I can throw into pots early in spring for sale at my local farmer's market probably. And that is the beautiful result. So thanks for watching the video today on propagating rosemary. I hope that answered some of your questions, and if you have any others, please drop them into the comments of the video, and I'll see what I can do to help.